The prison was silent the night a man on death row made his final request. He didn't ask for mercy. He didn't ask to see a lawyer. He asked to see his dog. One last time. No one understood why, until the animal stepped into the room and refused to leave a single piece of evidence behind. What happened next would expose a lie buried for years and force the truth back into the light. Stay with us, because this story changes everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. The blizzard knocks. The past turns on the light. Snow came sideways over the Colorado ridgeline, erasing fences, footprints, and the last excuse to pretend the world was quiet. The wind worried the pines like a hungry thing with teeth. Ethan Walker was 63 and built the way old granite is built, broad at the shoulders, a little sloped now, but still stubbornly there. His face carried the geometry of hard decisions, a square jaw softened by time, deep lines bracketing his mouth, and eyes the color of dark coffee left too long on the counter. His hair had gone a practical salt and pepper, clipped short because anything longer felt like surrender, and the gray stubble along his cheeks never quite became a beard, as if his body refused to commit to comfort. A healed scar ran near his left eyebrow, thin, pale, and always faintly amused, like it remembered a joke he didn't. He wore the same uniform of retirement he'd worn for years, a weathered field jacket the color of pine bark, a thick sweater beneath it, dark cargo pants, and boots that had seen more blood than most people's prayers. His hands looked older than his face, knuckles thick, fingers marked by old fractures, and when he flexed them, the joints whispered their complaints in a language only winter understood. In the little log house outside Silver Pine, Colorado, the heater clicked and sighed, trying to keep up, and the kettle on the stove performed its daily opera of impatience. Ethan stood at the window with a mug he wasn't really drinking, watching the whiteout swallow his driveway like a myth that disliked witnesses. He told himself he liked the solitude. He told himself a lot of things. Beside him lay Jex, a German shepherd who had aged into a kind of solemn legend. Jex's coat was black and tan, dulled by years, with a heavy shadow down the spine and a muzzle turned silver at the edges, as if frost had claimed him early. One ear stood upright, the other had a subtle bend, a permanent question mark from some long-ago scuffle Ethan didn't talk about. Jex's eyes were amber and unsettlingly aware, the kind of eyes that didn't just see a room, but took attendance of every emotion inside it. At 9, maybe 10, Ethan had stopped celebrating numbers. Jex moved with the careful economy of a dog who knew his body was no longer invincible, but had not informed his pride. He wore a sturdy dark collar and a simple working harness, not because he needed it in the house, but because Jex seemed to prefer being dressed for duty, like a soldier who felt naked without his gear. He didn't bark much. Barking was for dogs who didn't know what they were saying. Jex communicated in glances, in the placement of his body between Ethan and the door, in the way his nostrils flared when fear walked into a room wearing someone else's face. Ethan had once been SWAT, tense nights on rooftops, loud entries, quiet goodbyes, and the world had carved that life into him the way rivers carve stone, slowly, relentlessly, with no interest in his opinions. It wasn't one event that made him retire. It was the accumulation. A partner lost in a hallway too narrow for regret. A shoulder torn in a takedown that should have been routine. A decision made in 2 seconds that replayed for 2 years. He had come home from the job with a body that hurt and a mind that refused to clock out. For a while, he tried to outstare the nightmares, sit up through them, drink coffee through them, act like a man could win a staring contest with his own memory. Jex was the one who broke the tie, pressing his weight against Ethan's legs when the tremors came, planting his head on Ethan's lap when the air in the room turned into the air of some other place. The dog had been trained, yes, certified and documented and stamped by people who loved clipboards. But the deeper work, the sacred work, hadn't been taught. Jex simply decided Ethan belonged in the world of the living and made it difficult for him to disagree. Outside, the blizzard rattled the porch railing, and the snow drifted high against the steps like a barricade raised by an enemy with infinite supplies. Ethan watched it build and felt a familiar itch, the old urge to plan routes, to measure distances, to name exits. Then the phone rang. Not the friendly ring of a neighbor, not the polite chirp of a reminder. It rang like a knock in the middle of the night, a sound that assumed it would be answered. Ethan stared at it as if it might bite. JEX lifted his head without moving the rest of his body, eyes narrowing, reading the tension that tightened Ethan's shoulders. "No," Ethan muttered, "to the phone or to the past, hard to say." The phone rang again. The kettle whistled like it was laughing. Ethan picked up on the third ring, because something in him still believed in procedures. "Walker," he said, voice rough, gravel over steel. "Ethan," a man's voice replied, older and frayed, with a hint of city smoke trapped in it. "Don't hang up." Ethan's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the white fury outside, as if it might provide an excuse. "You've got the wrong number," he said automatically, even though he didn't. "I don't," the voice said. "It's Robert Hale." Ethan's jaw tightened. Robert Hale, called Bobby by the few people who liked him and Sir by everyone else, had been internal affairs back when Ethan was still collecting overtime and bruises. Hale was the kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts, tall but slightly stooped, wiry under a long coat, face cut into planes by stress rather than genetics. His hair, what was left of it, was a thin gray brush he tried to tame with stubbornness, and his eyes had that pale, sleepless look of someone who'd spent a career watching good men lie and bad men smile. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was precise. People resented him the way they resented mirrors. Ethan hadn't spoken to Hale in years, and the fact that Hale had found him felt like a hand reaching under the door. "Hale," Ethan said, and managed to make it sound like a warning. "I retired." "I heard," Hale replied. "I retired too. Turns out the system doesn't send you a fruit basket when you stop bleeding for it." Ethan almost laughed, one sharp, humorless breath. "Then why are you calling?" There was a pause, heavy enough to have fingerprints. "Because someone's going to die," Hale said, "and it looks like the paperwork wants him dead more than the truth does." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Jex rose slowly, joints clicking softly, and came to stand by Ethan's knee, not touching, just present, an anchor with fur. Ethan stared at the wooden cabinet across the room, the one he kept shut, the one that held old things he didn't need to see. "This isn't my job," Ethan said. "It isn't anyone's job," Hale replied. "That's the problem." Hale's words came out measured, like he was reading from a report he hated. "There's a man on death row, name's Daniel Brooks." Even through the phone, Ethan felt Hale's discomfort saying it, as if names had weight. Hale continued anyway. Mid-40s, brown hair in the old mugshot, probably going gray now. Lean build, the kind you get from standing 8-hour shifts and skipping meals. Not a gang guy, not a monster in the usual way. He works security for a resort developer down in the Springs. He got convicted of murdering a real estate investor. Big money, loud friends, lots of pressure for a clean story. Ethan's mind did what it always did when a case was described. It began building a hallway, placing doors, marking blind corners. He didn't want it to. It did it anyway. "Appeals are done," Hale said. "Execution date's close." Ethan's throat felt dry. "Why are you telling me?" Hale exhaled, and Ethan could picture the man rubbing his forehead, the way he used to in interview rooms when lies piled up. "Chain of custody," Hale said. "Evidence handling. Things don't line up. Not the way they should. I'm seeing signatures where signatures shouldn't be. Transfers to storage that don't have proper authorization. Reports that exist in one log, but not in another." Hale's voice dipped lower, the confessional tone of a man who'd spent too long in rooms with no windows. Someone bent the case. Maybe for ambition, maybe for protection. Maybe because it was easier than admitting the truth was messy. Ethan swallowed. He told himself he wasn't listening. He listened anyway. "Go to the Innocence Project," Ethan said. "Go to a journalist." "I did," Hale replied. "Everyone's circling, but nobody's inside the fence yet. And Daniel Brooks, he's made a final request. Ethan's stomach clenched as if it recognized the phrase "final request" as a weapon. "He wants to see your dog," Hale said. Ethan blinked. "My dog?" "Jex," Hale said, pronouncing it carefully, like he was reading a badge number. "He says Jex is certified as a PTSD service animal. He says he met you once, years ago, during a security training event. Claims Jex was there. He's asking for a human-centered visit, compassionate allowance. He says he needs to say goodbye." Ethan felt the old cynicism rise like bile. "And you believe that?" Hale's voice sharpened, not angry, just tired of foolishness. "I believe he's desperate. I believe desperate men say true things and false things in the same breath. But here's what I also believe. He mentioned something he shouldn't know unless he'd seen it or smelled it. He talked about a chemical smell on his jacket the night he was arrested, a smell like industrial cleaner. And he said, 'This is the part that made me call you.' He said if Jex gets near his personal property, Jex will react." Ethan's eyes flicked to Jex, who was watching him with that unnerving calm, as if the dog already knew the next page of the story. Ethan forced a short laugh. "Dogs react to everything," he said. "Mailmen, squirrels, my cooking." Jex's ears twitched at the word cooking, and Ethan almost smiled despite himself. The humor died quickly. Hale went on. "Daniel Brooks doesn't want a priest," Hale said. "He wants the dog, and he's asking for you by name." Ethan felt a cold pulse behind his ribs. "I'm not a handler anymore," he said. "I'm a man with a bad shoulder and a snowed-in driveway." "You're a man who used to kick down doors," Hale said quietly. "And you still have the instinct to know when something stinks." Ethan stared at the cabinet again. Behind that wood lived the neatly folded ghosts, his SWAT patch, his old badge, the small case with commendations he never opened because they felt like apologies written too late. He'd put them away like offerings to a god he no longer trusted. "This isn't your fight," Ethan said, as if repeating it might make it true. "It doesn't have to be," Hale answered. "But the dog, Ethan, the dog's part of it now, whether you like it or not." Ethan's mouth tightened. He hated how Hale sounded right. He hated even more that the part of him that still believed in duty stirred awake like a bear in winter, confused and angry. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. Hale didn't hesitate. "I want you to consider bringing Jex in for the visit," Hale said. "I want you to let your dog do what dogs do better than people, tell you what doesn't belong." Ethan closed his eyes. In the dark behind his eyelids, he saw corridors, saw flashing lights on snow, saw the moment you realize you're already moving before you've decided to. "I can't," he said, and meant it. He was tired. He was old in places age couldn't explain. He had built this little life of silence brick by brick, and he didn't want to watch it collapse. "I can't do this again." Hale's voice softened, almost human. "Then don't do it for the system," he said. "Do it because you know what it feels like when the world decides you're disposable." Ethan's eyes opened. Jex stepped closer and leaned his shoulder, carefully, respectfully, against Ethan's shin. A pressure that was half comfort, half verdict. Ethan's throat tightened. "You're asking me to walk into a prison during a blizzard," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to show up," Hale replied. "The weather's going to do what it wants. The question is whether you will." Ethan's silence stretched. The wind outside slapped snow against the glass like thrown handfuls of salt. Ethan set the phone down without hanging up, because he couldn't give Hale that finality yet. He stood there, breathing, listening to the house settle. He felt the old fear, not fear of guns or men, but fear of hope. Hope was the one thing that had always gotten him hurt. He looked at Jex. "No," Ethan said to the dog, trying for stern. "Don't start." Jex turned his head slowly toward the cabinet, the one Ethan kept shut, and walked to it with the deliberate gravity of a judge approaching the bench. Then Jex lifted one paw and scratched the wood, once, twice, 3 times, each scrape a small thunder in the quiet room. He paused, looked back at Ethan, and scratched again, harder. Ethan's chest tightened as if an invisible hand had found the same old bruise inside him. "Oh, you've got jokes," Ethan muttered, because if he didn't make it a joke, it would become a prayer. Jex didn't blink. The dog scratched again, then sat, straight-backed, eyes locked on Ethan like a sentry refusing to be bribed. Ethan walked to the cabinet with slow steps, as if approaching an altar he had abandoned. His fingers hovered over the handle. The wood was cold under his touch, colder than it should have been, as if winter had gotten inside. He didn't open it, not yet. But he rested his palm there and felt the weight of what waited behind it. The badge, the patch, the version of himself that believed doors were made to be breached if people were trapped behind them. Behind him, the phone remained on the counter, a silent witness. Outside, the blizzard roared its approval or its warning. Ethan looked down at Jex, at the graying muzzle, the steady amber eyes, the dog that had dragged him back from the edge more times than Ethan could count. "You're really going to make me do this," Ethan said, and there was a bitter fondness in it, like talking to a stubborn old friend. Jex's tail thumped once against the floor, one slow beat like a drum. Ethan exhaled, long and shaky, and felt something in him click into place with the same sound as a weapon being made safe and ready at the same time. Some winters, he understood, didn't allow hiding. Some winters knocked and waited until you answered. Snow tightened its grip as Ethan Walker drove toward the prison, a concrete island rising from white nothingness, its lights dull and unforgiving against the storm. The wipers scraped like old bones, and beside him, Jex sat upright, 12 years carved into his frame, broad-chested still, but with a graying muzzle and a stiffness in the left shoulder that betrayed winters survived and commands obeyed. Ethan felt the familiar pull between duty and retreat. He had told himself this would be procedural, humane, contained. The gate proved him wrong. Steel swallowed the truck, then spat it into a corridor of rules and eyes. Guards moved with practiced indifference. One young, clean-shaven, with a jaw too soft for the cold work he did. Another, older, shaved head gleaming, beard clipped to regulation, eyes that had learned not to linger. They checked paperwork twice, frowned at the dog's vest, then nodded when they saw the letters. PTSD service animal. Ethan read their posture like he once read Allie's. Defensive, bored, wary of exceptions. He kept his voice low, respectful, learned long ago that firmness without heat travels farther in winter. The visiting area smelled of bleach and metal fatigue. Cameras blinked. A public defender hovered at the edge of the room. Thin man, mid-40s, rumpled suit, eyes rimmed red from nights arguing with deadlines. He introduced himself without enthusiasm, as if names had become liabilities. Reporters were penned behind glass, faces pressed close, hungry for a final look at a man already rehearsed for death. Ethan ignored them. JX did not. The dog's ears tilted, nostrils flaring once, then again. When Daniel Brooks entered, escorted, shackles whispering on the floor, Ethan saw a man carved down to essentials. Brooks was early 40s, average height, shoulders sloped from years of apologizing to authority, hair dark and thinning at the crown, beard left unshaved not out of style but surrender. His skin held the gray cast of fluorescent days. He met Ethan's eyes without pleading, which surprised him. There was fear there, yes, but it had been folded and refolded until it fit a pocket. They were allowed a small table. The rules were recited. Ethan nodded. Brooks nodded. JX lay at heel, breathing measured, eyes soft but alert. A sealed tray of personal effects was placed between them. Wallet, belt, keys, a leather glove pair inside a clear bag, tagged and stamped. Ethan had seen this ritual before, had believed in it once. Brooks spoke quietly, voice roughened by disuse. He said he had worked security at a luxury resort, had known the murdered developer only as a face that didn't return greetings. He said the night of his arrest had smelled wrong, like a pool room after closing, like solvents. He did not say innocence, he said wrong. Ethan listened without nodding. JEX rose. It was not dramatic. The dog stood, stepped forward, nose hovering over the tray, then fixed on the right glove. He sniffed once, then pressed closer, whining low, a sound he made only when a command conflicted with the truth. He pawed the bag, nails ticking against plastic, then froze and looked at Ethan, amber eyes steady. The message was not magic. It was training meeting anomaly. Ethan felt the old switch flip, the one that refused coincidence. A guard shifted, annoyed. Ethan asked for a moment, voice calm. The guard hesitated, then waved toward the office at the far end where the warden stood, arms crossed, assessing the room like a chessboard. Warden Sarah Whitlock was tall and spare, late 50s, haircut blunt at the jaw in iron-gray precision, skin weathered pale from decades under institutional lights. Her eyes were a hard hazel that missed nothing. Her mouth carried a line earned by choosing order over comfort. She had come up through custody when policy still allowed bruises to be called training, and it showed in the way she held herself, square, unromantic, not unkind. Ethan introduced himself, offered his badge number from a life ago without apology. He explained the dog's reaction, careful not to overstate. Whitlock's gaze flicked to JEX, then to the glove, then back to Ethan. "Dogs react," she said. "So do men." It was not dismissal, it was a test. Ethan passed by not arguing. He asked instead for protocol, chain of custody, storage conditions, who had last handled the items. Whitlock exhaled once. "You can ask," she said. "Answers won't be fast." She paused, then added, "But I'll authorize a veterinary check. Your dog looks older than your paperwork." The infirmary was warmer. Dr. Miguel Alvarez met them there, a compact man in his early 40s with olive skin and kind eyes that had learned restraint. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hands steady, his manner practical. He spoke to JEX as if to an equal, not babying, not distant. He listened to Ethan's account, then to JEX's breathing, fingers light along the shoulder. "Degenerative joint disease," he said softly. "Manageable. Cold aggravates it. He's tough, but toughness borrows from tomorrow." Ethan nodded, a weight settling. Alvarez wrote a note, recommended dosage adjustments, warned against prolonged exposure. Ethan pocketed the paper like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Back in the visiting room, the lawyer leaned closer, voice dropping. "If you're suggesting contamination, you'll need more than a dog's opinion," he said, not unkindly. Ethan agreed. He asked for the lab reports tied to the gloves. The lawyer laughed without humor, if they exist. Brooks watched all this with the stillness of a man who has learned to be invisible. When Ethan met his eyes again, Brooks spoke one sentence. "I didn't wear those gloves to work." That was all. The guard cleared his throat. Time. As they left, JEX glanced once more at the tray, then at Whitlock. The warden held his gaze a beat longer than necessary. Outside, the storm had worsened. Ethan loaded the dog carefully, joints stiff, breath fogging. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, hands resting where a steering wheel had once been a rifle stock. He felt the old itch, to dig, to catalog, to rebuild a night until it confessed. He also felt fear, new and unwelcome. JEX's age, the thin margin winter demanded, the cost of pulling on a thread that did not want to be found. When the engine finally turned over, Ethan knew he would not sleep until he knew what smelled wrong, and why the iron halls had learned to pretend they could not. Ethan Walker drove west into the foothills, where the road narrowed and the snow lay heavier, the kind of place where secrets felt comfortable. Jex rode shotgun, chin lifted, eyes tracking the dark pines, as if the forest itself were a ledger waiting to be audited. The blizzard had eased into a brittle cold, the air sharp enough to etch thoughts clean. Ethan kept the heater low for Jex's joints, and because discomfort helped him think. He replayed the prison visit in his head, the glove, the whine, the look, and let the old instincts uncoil without apology. He was done pretending coincidence was a theory worth defending. The cabin belonged to Robert Bobby Hale, retired internal affairs, and it wore its owner like a confession. Built in the late 70s, it crouched among spruce with a roof that sagged a little in the middle, as if tired of holding things in. Hale opened the door before Ethan knocked. He looked thinner than Ethan remembered, tall but hollowed, shoulders slumped by a lifetime of leaning into resistance. His hair had retreated to a gray fringe he didn't bother taming, and his beard, once regulation neat, had gone wiry, a map of impatience. His eyes, pale and alert, still missed nothing. "You came," Hale said, not smiling but relieved. Inside, the cabin smelled of old paper and black coffee. A single lamp lit a table buried under boxes, banker's boxes, labeled by hand. Hale moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste motion. "I told myself I was done," he said, gesturing Ethan in. "Turns out being done doesn't take." Jex sniffed the threshold, then entered, nails clicking softly, posture polite but attentive. Hale paused, studied the dog with a professional's curiosity. "That's him," he said. "Jex." He didn't reach out. He knew better than to rush a working dog. They sat. Hale slid a folder across the table. "I smelled it years ago," he said. "But the room went quiet when I spoke up." He tapped the folder. Camera data, resort garage, the night of the murder. Ethan leaned in. The stills were grainy, time-stamped, then abruptly skipped. "Cut," Ethan said. "Clean." Hale nodded. Not a glitch, a splice, 12 minutes missing. He flipped to another page, chain of custody logs, signatures stacked like excuses. One name repeated with a flourish that leaned right, then left, then right again. "Signature drift," Hale said. "The hand wasn't steady, or it wasn't the same hand." Ethan's mouth tightened. He'd seen forged confidence before. Hale produced a third item, a call detail record printed on thin paper. "Burner," he said. "Called a number registered to the resort's maintenance office at 9:14 p.m., same window as the murder. The phone pings near the garage, then disappears." Ethan pictured the garage, echoes, concrete, solvent smells. Jex stood and moved closer to the table. He sniffed the edge of the folder, then circled once, nose hovering over a small evidence bag Hale retrieved from a box. Inside lay a torn strip of fabric, dark wool, and a disassembled wristwatch, its face cracked, hands stilled at 9:17. Jex's posture changed. He stiffened, whined low, then pressed his nose to the bag with insistence that was not training alone, but recognition. Ethan felt the hair on his arms lift. "That watch," Hale said quietly. "Never logged as evidence. Found it myself during an off-books walkthrough. I was told to put it back where it wouldn't complicate things." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "Complication is the job," he said. Hale's laugh was brief and bitter. "Not when the check clears." Ethan didn't need names yet. He needed patterns. Jex pawed the bag once, then looked up at Ethan, the same steady look from the prison. Ethan nodded to the dog. "All right," he murmured. "I hear you." They worked for an hour, assembling fragments. The fabric matched a coat issued to resort supervisors, not security. The solvent smell aligned with pool chemicals stored near the maintenance cage. The camera splice required access, someone with keys and confidence. Hale leaned back, fatigue carving lines deeper into his face. "I pushed," he said. "They pushed back." Retirement was the compromise. Ethan felt a familiar anger rise, clean and useful. "Who benefits?" he asked. Hale named a developer with friends who bought silence wholesale. Ethan closed the folder. "I'll need copies," he said. Hale slid a flash drive across the table. "Already made," he said. "And Ethan, this part matters. Someone's been asking about you." The drive home was quiet. Jex slept lightly, breath even, dreaming in small twitches. Ethan's thoughts moved faster than the road. At his place, the lock on the door sat wrong, scuffed, proud. Inside, drawers stood ajar like mouths mid-denial. The cabinet was open. His old badge lay on the table, placed, not dropped. A message without words. Ethan's pulse slowed, the way it always did when fear decided to be useful. He checked corners, angles, listened. Jex rose, hackles lifting, ears slicing the air. The garage light flickered on without being asked. Ethan moved, weight low, hand up to steady Jex. The ambush came quiet, a shadow stepping from behind the truck, a rush of breath. Jex barked once, sharp as glass, and lunged, shoulder slamming Ethan's thigh. They went down together as a swing passed where Ethan's head had been. The attacker cursed, boots scraping concrete. Jex snapped, not to bite, but to warn, teeth inches from flesh. The man fled into the snow, fast and practiced. Ethan lay still for a beat, heart hammering, then sat up. "Good boy," he breathed, hands shaking as he checked Jex for injury. The dog stood, proud but winded, eyes blazing. Ethan closed the door, bolted it, and leaned against it until the world steadied. He looked at the open cabinet, the badge catching the light. This wasn't about justice anymore, not the clean kind. It was about survival, and truth had teeth. He set the flash drive on the table, poured water instead of whiskey, and began to plan like a man who remembered how. The storm arrived like a verdict, sudden and unarguable, whitening the world until edges forgot themselves. Ethan Walker watched the barometer sink from the kitchen window, the mountains erased behind a curtain of driven snow. Cell service flickered between 1 bar and none, a Morse code of abandonment. He tightened the strap on Jex's insulated harness with hands that remembered colder nights and louder rooms. The dog stood patiently, 12 years old now, tall and powerful still, but worn at the shoulder, coat dulled to iron gray along the muzzle, breath rasping faintly in the cold. Jex's eyes, amber and steady, never left Ethan. They had learned each other's weather. Ethan chose the gamble because it was the only move left that used truth as bait instead of armor. He seeded the rumor through a channel he knew would leak, an old evidence clerk with a fondness for coffee and gossip, a man whose soft belly and thinning blonde hair hid a survival instinct honed by watching other people fall. The message was simple and plausible. Ethan had located a decisive item buried in storage, something small and overlooked, something that would unspool a chain. He did not name it. He did not need to. In systems like this, the guilty recognize silhouettes. The reply came hours later, through a burner that buzzed once and died. Coordinates followed. An abandoned warehouse on the river flats, its corrugated walls known for echoing footsteps and swallowing screams. Ethan studied the map, traced exits with a finger, measured wind and drift. He packed light. He left the badge at home. He did not leave Jex. The drive-out was a slow violence of white. Headlights tunneled through flakes the size of moths. Ethan parked downwind, killed the engine, listened. The warehouse crouched ahead, sodium lamps breathing a sickly yellow that barely warmed the snow. Jex moved close, shoulder brushing Ethan's thigh, breath steaming, the old injury nagging. Ethan touched the dog's neck once. Permission, promise, apology. He took a wide arc, counting doors, memorizing angles. Age had stolen his sprint, not his sense. He set his exit first. Inside, the air tasted of rust and cold oil. A single lamp hung from a cord, swaying. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. The man who entered wore a parka too clean for the place, hood trimmed with synthetic fur, boots polished despite the storm. He was mid-50s, tall, thick through the middle, hair dark and meticulously combed back, beard shaved to the skin as if he feared leaving evidence of himself anywhere. His face held the practiced neutrality of someone who negotiated outcomes for a living. A fixer. His name, Ethan would learn later, was Grant Mallory. Mallory's eyes were pale blue and flat, the eyes of a man who had learned to survive by standing between worse men and their messes. "You're late," Mallory said mildly. "You're early," Ethan replied. He kept his hands visible, posture easy. Jex sat at heel, chest rising, eyes tracking Mallory's boots. Mallory smiled without warmth. "You have something." "So do you," Ethan said. "We should trade." Mallory gestured. Another figure emerged from the shadows, shorter, broader, face pocked, hair buzzed to the scalp. A local muscle with a boxer's nose and knuckles scarred by bad decisions. He did not speak. He watched Jex with unease. Ethan filed that away. They closed distance. Mallory's voice stayed calm, the way prosecutors sound when they believe time is on their side. He spoke of interests, of mistakes that could be corrected, of the mercy of forgetting. Ethan listened and thought of Robert Hale's tired eyes, of Sarah Whitlock's measured spine, of Daniel Brooks's folded fear. He shook his head. "You're selling fog," he said. Mallory's expression tightened. "You're old," he said softly, "and your dog is hurt." It was not a threat, it was an assessment. The muscle shifted his weight. Snow hissed against the metal walls. Ethan moved first, not fast, but true. He angled toward his exit, forcing Mallory to pivot, forcing the muscle to choose. Jex surged, barking once, sharp and final, drawing eyes. The muscle lunged. Ethan dropped his center, turned, used Mallory's reach against him, slamming him into a pallet. Pain flared in Ethan's shoulder, white and blinding, but he rode it, teeth bared, breath steady. Jex snapped at the muscle's sleeve, not to tear but to hold, teeth finding fabric and refusing to let go. The man cursed, swung. The lamp swung too, shadows shattering. Mallory staggered back, clutching a leather satchel. Jex lunged again, jaws clamping the strap. The satchel tore with a sound like a rib breaking. Its contents spilled, USB drives skittering across concrete, photocopies fanning in the draft, bank transfer sheets stamped and initialed, dates lining up like soldiers. Mallory froze, eyes flicking from paper to paper, calculating damage. The muscle wrenched free and kicked. Jex yelped, a short, shocked sound, and went down hard, shoulder striking concrete. Ethan roared, a sound torn from somewhere older than words, and drove into the man, using leverage, not strength, dropping him with a sweep he'd taught rookies who never listened. Mallory bolted for the door. Ethan tried to follow, and his shoulder failed him, pain buckling his knees. He hit the floor, breath gone, stars crowding his vision. Snow blew in, cold and bright. Mallory escaped into the storm. Ethan did not chase. He crawled to JEX, hands shaking, fingers probing the shoulder. The dog lay still for a breath that felt like a lifetime, then thumped his tail once, stubborn as a vow. Blood seeped through fur, dark against gray. Ethan pressed his forehead to JEX's neck and breathed until the world steadied. Sirens were distant, maybe imagined, maybe not. He gathered what he could, drives, papers, stuffed them into his coat. He made the call when the signal returned in a single merciful bar, his voice calm, precise, the way it had always been when things mattered most. The storm did not stop. It never does for a man in the middle of a choice. But Ethan had the proof now, and the cost was written on his shoulder and in JEX's blood. He carried the dog into the night, careful and slow, knowing that dawn would come whether he was ready or not. The winter sky hung low and colorless. The morning justice finally decided to wake up, a dull gray ceiling pressing down on the valley, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Snow lay in thin, disciplined sheets across the ground, no longer wild or drifting, but settled, resigned to its place. Ethan stood on the porch of his cabin when the call came, the wood beneath his boots creaking softly, the cold biting but no longer cruel. He was a man worn by time and responsibility, late 50s edging into 60, tall and broad in the shoulders, though slightly stooped, as if life had leaned on him a moment too long. His hair was cropped short, iron gray, his beard trimmed close out of habit rather than vanity. Deep lines framed his mouth and eyes, the kind carved not by age alone, but by vigilance, by decades of watching corners and reading rooms for danger that never announced itself politely. Beside him sat Jex, the German shepherd who had shared both his worst hours and his quietest victories. JEX's once lustrous black and tan coat was now muted, weathered like old leather, his muzzle silvered with age. One ear bore a clean notch, a souvenir from another life, and the scars along his neck and shoulders told stories Ethan never asked him to repeat. At 7, maybe 8 years old, JEX no longer moved with the reckless confidence of youth, but with something better, judgment. His amber eyes tracked the world calmly, intelligently, his breathing steady after weeks of careful recovery. The surgery had not made him young again, but it had given him back distance, the ability to walk farther, to stand longer, to greet the snow without flinching. When the phone vibrated in Ethan's hand, JEX lifted his head, sensing change before understanding it. The voice on the other end belonged to an internal investigator, clipped and precise, a man who sounded like he had learned long ago not to celebrate early. Evidence had been delivered, complete, verified, unavoidable, straight into the hands of a federal judge who had no personal stake left to protect. An emergency hearing had been called, despite the weather, despite the calendar, despite the inconvenience. The machine that had slept through corruption was grinding awake. Ethan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his breath fogging the air. When the call ended, he didn't move for several seconds. JEX stood and pressed his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg, a wordless question. "It's done," Ethan said quietly, unsure who he was telling, the dog, himself, or the mountains that had borne witness to too much silence. The hearing moved fast, propelled by urgency and embarrassment in equal measure. Files once buried were unfolded under fluorescent lights, lies exposed not by anger but by sequence. The conviction of Daniel Brooks, built on manipulated evidence and convenient omissions, collapsed under the weight of truth. The man who had twisted the system for profit and protection was taken into custody, his confidence draining away in a room that no longer bent for him. A chain of corruption surfaced like dark rock under melting snow, undeniable and sharp. Outside, winter watched, indifferent. Ethan did not attend the hearing. He had learned that some closures are louder if experienced from a distance. Instead, he walked the ridge trail with Jex, step by careful step, boots crunching softly where ice still clung to shadow. His body ached in familiar places, knees that remembered concrete floors, shoulders that remembered weight, but the ache felt earned now, no longer accusatory. Jex kept pace, harness snug against his broad chest, tail swinging low and steady. Once he stumbled slightly, corrected himself, and continued, stubborn and dignified. Ethan slowed without comment. By afternoon, the confirmation arrived in writing. The words were formal, restrained, but their meaning landed with quiet force. The sentence overturned, the case reopened, justice no longer asleep. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight thin through the window, and read the letter twice. He did not feel triumph. He felt usefulness return, like circulation to a limb long numb. That was enough. News traveled fast in a small valley. By evening, Sarah arrived, her tires whispering over packed snow. She stepped out of her car briskly, a woman in her late 30s with a tall, slender frame and the posture of someone accustomed to standing her ground. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low, slightly messy bun, practical rather than styled, a few loose strands catching the cold light. Her skin was pale with winter, her hazel eyes alert and thoughtful behind the fatigue she did not bother to hide. She wore a long charcoal parka, dark jeans, and boots meant for weather rather than appearance. Sarah had spent weeks moving between offices and archives, following threads others preferred left tangled. The effort had sharpened her, made her quieter, more precise, but had not dulled her compassion. When she saw Ethan, she smiled, small but genuine. When she noticed JEX, her expression softened entirely. "He looks stronger," she said, kneeling with care, letting JEX decide the distance. He sniffed her glove once and accepted her presence, tail tapping the snow once like a period at the end of a sentence. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and clean wood. Sarah explained the outcome, though Ethan already knew the shape of it. They spoke of judges and timelines, of consequences finally aligned with actions. There was relief in her voice, but also something like grief, for the time lost, the damage already done. "It won't fix everything," she said. Ethan nodded. "It never does." That night passed without ceremony. No champagne, no speeches. Just two people and a dog, sharing a quiet meal while the wind brushed the windows like a passing thought. Later, when Sarah left, the stars emerged, sharp, cold, honest. Ethan stood outside for a long moment, JEX at his side, both of them breathing the same thin air. Days followed, gentle and unremarkable in the best way. JEX's recovery continued slowly, deliberately. He did not chase shadows or test his limits. He walked, rested, walked again. Ethan adjusted his own pace to match, discovering that slowness held its own revelations. On the third morning after the ruling, the sky cleared fully. A pale blue spread overhead, the kind that only appears after storms have exhausted themselves. Ethan opened the old cabinet by the door and took out the SWAT badge he had placed there years ago, unable to decide whether it represented pride or failure. He turned it once in his hand, feeling its familiar weight, then set it back, not hidden, not displayed. Returned. Jex lay down at his feet, resting his head against Ethan's boot, eyes half closed, breathing even. Snow glittered outside, thin and temporary. Justice, Ethan knew, was never perfect. But this time, it had arrived in time. And as the sun rose higher over the quiet valley, a door he thought had closed forever stood open, unforced, waiting. In the end, the miracle wasn't thunder or light breaking the sky. It was quieter than that. It was a tired man who chose to stand up one more time, a loyal dog who refused to let go, and a truth that survived being buried under fear and snow. Sometimes God doesn't stop the storm. Sometimes He sends strength into the middle of it, asking us to walk forward even when our hands shake and our hearts are heavy. In everyday life, justice looks the same way. It's choosing honesty when shortcuts whisper, compassion when bitterness feels easier, and courage when silence feels safe. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs. Leave a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching.